Hello and welcome to another episode of Anomalies. I like to think of this program as, you're going down life's pathways and you find some interesting twists and turns. Sometimes they're mysterious, and you take those twists and turns. And we're going to take one of those twists and turns today off the road of life. I've got, Ira, you say your last name, Kitmacher?
Exactly. Perfect.
Okay. Oh, well, good. Good. I perfected something. So today we have Ira Kitmacher, and he gets to talk about one of my favorite places on earth, Olympia, Washington, which is where I live. And he is involved in a ghost tour that they do in Olympia, which I'm anxious to go on. So we want to welcome you, Ira. Thanks for coming on Anomalies, and we're happy to have you.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks for having me.
Sure. Now, tell me how you got involved with Pretty Gritty Tours. I
Okay.
know Chris a little bit. We've had him on a program before, but tell me
Right.
about your involvement.
Um, I'll take a step back and say my background wouldn't necessarily make sense in leading me to get involved with doing these tours. I was actually a senior executive with the federal government in Washington, D.C. Uh,
Wow.
I retired from that job in 2019. I'm a lawyer, and I've been a professor for the last 20 plus years, Georgetown University and Portland State and
Portland
Oregon,
State.
other
Yeah, I think I
colleges.
saw that. Okay, cool.
And
Uh,
um, and so when I retired in 2019, my wife and I decided wanted to come back to the West Coast. We'd actually moved from the San Francisco Bay Area to Washington,
mm,
D.C., came back to the West Coast. And the first place we settled actually was not in Olympia. It was on the coast itself, on the Long Beach Peninsula, which just north of Astoria, Oregon, better known as the graveyard of the Pacific. So, so I've been fascinated with history and haunted folklore for as long as I can remember. I have always, whenever I have the chance, I've always gone on haunted tours of Gettysburg, the Gettysburg battlefield, and Colonial Williamsburg, and New Orleans, and Tucson, Arizona, other places. So I've always been fascinated by it. And once I had retired from my full-time job with the federal government, it was 2019. Of course, we were just about to get started with COVID. And I decided very quickly I did not want to be fully retired. I wanted to be doing other things. And so I started writing. And I didn't write about the things that I had done in my past, whether it be law or government or management, although I continued to teach college classes on those topics. Rather, I started writing books about haunted folklore.
mm.
Um, and so my first book it's actually called Haunted Graveyard of the Pacific, in which I tell of the dozens, if not hundreds, of ghost stories and other strange things that have happened between Tillamook, Oregon, and Vancouver Island in Canada. So the whole northern Oregon and Washington coasts. And so I wrote that book. That came out, I believe, in 2021. 2022, I actually wrote two books. One was called Spirits Along the Columbia River, which told ghost stories again in Oregon and Washington and along the Columbia River, which separates the two states. And I also wrote another book, not about the Pacific Northwest. This was actually about Europe in the lead up to World War II, and what were the strange folkloric beliefs of the Germans and the people that they persecuted and others and the Allies. And so I wrote that book in 2022. And I also, and tell me if I'm going into too much detail.
No, you're
Um,
doing fine.
okay, so also I believe it's 2021, I decided that I wanted to start leading tours of the Graveyard of the Pacific, based on that first book that I wrote. So I approached the local chambers of commerce on the Long Beach Peninsula, and we started holding weekly tours on board a bus, which looks like an old-fashioned trolley. And I did that for probably 5 or 6 months, and it was very successful. And I dressed up in 1880s clothing, and uh,
Mhm.
I was actually the Long Beach, Washington, a town on the coast, celebrated its 100th anniversary. I was the history keynote speaker at that. Also, at some point during all that, the Oregon Ghost Conference happened in Seaside, Oregon. I was a keynote speaker at that. And so I've just kept busy with all that. And then almost a year ago, my wife and I moved to Olympia from the coast. And I've been again researching these ghost stories, mainly in the Pacific Northwest, and writing about them for now about 5 years. And once I came here, I started working on two new books. They'll both be coming out in around Halloween 2024. I should say that all these haunted books are put out by the same publisher, which is the History Press, which is part of Arcadia Publishing. And they're published nationally, and they're on Amazon and booksellers and things like that. So the two new ones, I won't go into any real detail because they still need to be published. But one is about the ghost stories of the Puget Sound region, including Olympia, and going up Puget Sound, Tacoma, and Seattle, and Bellingham, and other places. And then the other one is a more general book about the legends and folklore of the Pacific Northwest, to include the cryptids, Bigfoot and the sea serpents and others, and also the other stories that people have passed on for decades, if not centuries, in the Pacific Northwest. So those again will be coming out around Halloween 2024. When we moved here to Olympia almost a year ago, I wanted to keep on doing tours. I really enjoy doing tours. And before I started with Pretty Gritty Tours, I actually approached the Olympia Sailing Company, which has an old-fashioned schooner that looks like a miniature Pirates of the Caribbean ship. And so
Mhm.
last summer, we actually did a couple of months of tours on board the old-fashioned schooner. It holds 6 guests, and then the crew. And so we would go out into Puget Sound, and I would tell many of these ghost stories and other strange things that have gone on in the Olympia area and Puget Sound. And it was a 2-hour tour, and that went very well. And then I approached Chris of Pretty Gritty Tours, and I said, I'm here in Olympia. I had read great things about Pretty Gritty Tours. I love the YouTube videos that Chris has put out, and so I approached him about I'm interested in starting tours here in Olympia. So he actually came down. We walked the tour route that I had in mind, and that's when we started. So we started last September, and I did them up until Thanksgiving. They were oversubscribed every time. Some tours we had as many as 35 people. I decided that that was probably a little too many trying to get around downtown Olympia. So we scaled it back to 25 people, but we were full every tour, 25 or 35 people from the beginning of September until almost Thanksgiving. And lots of very positive feedback, positive reviews. And then I took a break through the holidays, and then I started back up again after the first of the year. And so now we're approaching the 5th week. And the numbers are down a little bit from the fall, which I was expecting, but they're not down that much. For instance, I'm doing a tour tomorrow night of downtown Olympia, and right now we have 18 people signed up for it. So, and I've also been asked by state agencies, they would like to do team building exercises to include a history and haunted tour of downtown Olympia. So I've done one of those, and then we have another one coming up in the next couple of months. And then I'll stop talking by saying that the one book that I mentioned, where I wrote about the history and folklore in Europe in the lead up to World War II, I actually approached a tour company in Europe about co-leading tours in through Germany and other places, and they loved the idea, and so we're getting that ready to go. And right now it's planned for starting in August. So I've been to Europe. I'm not an expert about Europe, but again, I wrote this book having researched it for several years, and so I'll be co-leading it with someone who's actually an expert on the physical locations while I talk about more of the content from the book. And so that's about it.
Well, I would say very cool.
Yeah.
Before I started doing podcasts, I was involved in something called the Olympia Paranormal Research Group. So
Hmm.
we're kindred spirits,
Right.
Bigfoot, ghosts, UFOs, all that kind of stuff. So
Right.
I just think that's really a great thing to offer here in Olympia. So one question kind of comes up. To what you're obviously an author. To what degree are you a paranormal researcher or investigator?
And I missed the first what you said.
Yeah, to what degree are you a paranormal researcher or investigator?
Um, I would say I've spent the majority of the last 5 years researching, reading old newspapers, old government reports, court records, native oral history, just a variety of things. So I think of myself probably first as a researcher, and that does tie into my background as a government senior executive and as a lawyer. I really enjoy researching and
Hmm.
organizing, and so that's what I spend probably the majority of my time doing. And then the writing these books is based on the research that I'm doing.
Sure. So let's talk a little bit about the tour. So if one wants to take the Oli uh, your tour here in Olympia, what are the dynamics of that? I think I read you guys start down by the Oyster House. Is that where the
Right,
tour gathers? Now,
right.
do you sign up beforehand, or can you sign up on the night of the tour? So talk a little bit about the logistics of that.
Okay. So the best way to sign up for it is to go to Pretty Gritty Tours website and go to the Olympia History and Haunted tour and sign up for it and pay for it that way. I have had people approach me on the street as I'm about to start the tour and say, "What is this tour? Oh, I'd love to go. Can I go? Can I pay you now?" And so we do that too. But the vast majority of people do sign up through the Pretty Gritty Tours website. And right now we have it capped at 25 people. Um, Although if there's a few people over, that's fine. And you're right, we do start in between the Olympia Oyster House and the Kissing Statue at
Hmm.
Percival Landing. So we start there. I've been doing it in the fall. I was doing it both Friday and Saturday nights. I've scaled it back to one night a week, at least for the time being, mainly because of the weather.
Right.
It's been a little tough. The first tour, when I got started back up again in January, it was 18 degrees and it was just tough for people. And then it's rained several of the tours, although we continue to do it. We do it rain or shine. And I'm dressed for the weather and hopefully people are too. But I'm scaling it back to one night a week, at least for a couple of months until maybe the weather improves and then we'll get it back going again.
So the tour is totally outside,
It is
outdoors.
totally outside.
Give me a
Um,
sense of where you go in
okay.
downtown. I live pretty close to the Oyster House, so just kind of sketch out where you go.
Okay. So I follow, I've again researched the history of Olympia. I've done lots of research about the history of Olympia. And the tour route is the downtown historic district. So there are 5 stops total, including where we start. We start at Percival Landing, which is again in between the Olympia Oyster House and the Kissing Statue. And that's Olympia's historic dock. It's the main marina. It has been since 1877. And so that's where we start. And while I'm there, I start with a wide angle lens, as I say, of the Pacific Northwest. And I always start by saying the Pacific Northwest, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the most haunted regions in the country. And when I've done other interviews, podcast interviews, other interviews, especially with folks back on the East Coast, they typically will say, "Well, what do you mean the Pacific Northwest is one of the most haunted regions? All you have is Bigfoot out
Yeah,
there."
really.
And then
Yeah.
I go through the whole history of the graveyard of the Pacific and all the ghost stories and all the calamities that have struck the region. And by the time I'm finished, they usually say, "Okay, we stand corrected. You do have lots of haunted history out there." So I love talking about the history and these haunted stories. And so while I'm at Percival Landing, I balance sort of the history with the haunted. I talk about how Olympia has been the capital first of the Washington Territory since 1853, when the Washington Territory broke off from the Oregon Territory. I talk about Puget Sound itself because we're looking out at Puget Sound. I talk about how there used to be a fleet of small steamboats that went around Puget Sound. That was the main way people got around in the late 1800s. It was called the Mosquito Fleet from the
Hmm.
1880s to the 1920s. There were 73 shipwrecks in those waters, and the
Wow.
water tends to be, it's pretty shallow here in Olympia, But further north you go, Tacoma, and especially north of that, it can get up to be 1,000 feet deep. It's very murky. And many of those 73 ships have never been brought back up. Their crews are still in the water. And so I refer to that as a watery graveyard. So I
Mhm.
talk about the Puget Sound region. And as I started to say, I start with a wide angle lens and I say, let's talk for a few minutes about where we are in Olympia. We're part of the greater Pacific Northwest. One of the most haunted regions near here is called the Graveyard of the Pacific. And then I talk about how the coastal areas have had over 2,000 shipwrecks, countless lost lives. And so then I give 3 examples of the ghost stories from the Graveyard of the Pacific. Then I bring it closer to a few of the towns that are near Olympia. I talk about Bukoda, Joint Base Lewis McChord. Look at my notes here. I also talk about McNeil Island up the
Mhm.
Puget Sound and the ghost stories related to those. And then I talk exclusively about Olympia the rest of the time. So we start at Percival Landing, we talk for about 15 minutes, and then we start walking. We end up next to the Brotherhood Lounge, or Broho, as
Mhm.
it's
You know where that is?
refer I refer to that part of Olympia. So we've moved from the historical marina or dock at Percival Landing. We move to the Brotherhood Lounge, which I call the old rough and tumble area, because that's where the red light district was back in from 1860 until 1910. There were houses of prostitution, there were opium dens, there was gambling, and there was lots of violence going on. So I talk about the red light district. It also went by a different name, which was the dead zone.
Hmm.
That was actually what the Olympia City Council called it, because they, in 1880, decided that area was dead to the laws. They couldn't enforce the laws to get
Oh.
people to stop prostitution and opium dens. So they said, okay, this is dead to the laws, but we're going to send the police chief out to collect money from the owners of the houses of prostitution and other business owners. And that continued until 1910. And then I talk about a couple of the haunted buildings in and around that area, Brotherhood Lounge itself, the Olympian newspaper building. I talk about how the first Washington Territorial Legislature building was on a now a vacant parking lot, but that was a 2-story building in 1854. I talk about that. And I work in some other stories related to Olympia, including going 3,000 miles away to Philadelphia, where the USS Olympia is tied up, named for this city, and it's thought to be the second most haunted ship in the country after the Queen Mary in Southern California. And throughout my talking about all these things, I'm of course saying um, Olympia has a wonderful history. It's a city of rebirth. It's bounced back from 3 major fires, 4 earthquakes, but that's not what we're going to focus on. We're going to focus on the darker history, these ghost stories, haunted history, and the crime and mayhem kinds of things that have happened in Olympia. So I talk about those as well. And I'm not going into any specifics I can at any point, but just taking on a quick tour of where we're going.
Sure,
So
sure.
from there, from the Brotherhood Lounge, we then walk about a block and a half to what I call the theater district, because the State Theater and the Capitol Theater are both near
Mhm.
there. And I talk again about a few of the buildings that are said to be haunted, the Spar Cafe and the Security Building, which is a 5-story building. I think it's right around corners of 4th and 5th in downtown. And it was Olympia's original skyscraper, even though it's only 5 stories high. I talk about the artesian wells and the urban legends related to the artesian wells. Then we walk to what I call the Civic Center and Government Center by the old Capitol building. So there's a building that its nickname is the Castle because it looked an awful lot like a castle until it was severely damaged in a 1928 fire and then the 1949 earthquake. But I talk about that. I talk about Sylvester Park, which was donated to the city of Olympia by one of the 2 co-founders, whose
Mhm.
last name was Sylvester. I talk about Forest Memorial Garden Cemetery in Olympia, which is also said to be haunted. I go into specifics about when I'm saying haunted. I try to be clear. Are we talking about full-bodied apparitions? They look like real people, but maybe they're translucent, or you can see through them, or they're only partial bodies, or are they orbs, floating balls of light,
Mm-hmm.
or are they a poltergeist, German word meaning noisy
Noisy
ghost,
ghost, right?
right? And so a ghost that's thought to be able to hurt the living or push and pull. And so I try to be clear about what the evidence says as far as what type of ghost. And then we end up at the fifth stop is what I call the old Chinatown section. There used to be a Chinatown in Olympia, again back near Fifth. I think it's Washington and Fifth, somewhere in there. And I'd go through the history, the dark history of the Chinatowns in the Pacific Northwest and how the Chinese were persecuted. I tell a few more ghost stories, including a 1934 story about a dynamite factory that exploded and killed 11 people, and the ghosts of that have been seen. And so that's the area that I cover. So it's 5 stops in the downtown historic district.
So tell us a ghost story out of all those stops that you made. Tell us a ghost story that you share with the group.
Okay. Well, let's see. Let me pick out some Olympia ones. I have ones obviously for the Graveyard of the Pacific and for Tacoma and the Puget Sound area. Um, uh, the Capitol Theater in downtown Olympia
I was hoping you'd go there, really.
dates back to 1924. It's a very old theater. The legend is that there was a murder inside the theater in the 1930s. In 2010, a ghost hunting company set up shop there. You can still see the YouTube videos of what
I
they
think I've
found,
seen that. Yeah, I think I've seen that.
and they certified the theater as haunted. They said that there were orbs and temperature changes and disembodied footsteps and disembodied voices. And then probably the most famous ghost in that theater is said to be an elderly movie goer who's sitting up in the upper balcony seats, sitting as if they're enjoying watching a movie. And when anyone approaches him, he supposedly dissipates. He goes up in thin air and disappears, but he's been seen for decades. So that's probably one of the more interesting spots
Hmm.
uh, that we talk about. Um, there are others. The old state capitol dates back to 1892, and it was the state capitol, I believe, until I don't have my notes right in front of me, but 1908 or so. And then, of course, we had the new state capitol with the dome built. Now the old state capitol houses the director of public instruction for
Hmm.
the state of Washington. It's an old building. And as I said earlier, it looks an awful lot like a castle, and it used to look even more like a castle. The story is that the security system goes off frequently at night, and the Olympia police are called, and they go in, and they never find
Nobody
anything,
there. Yeah.
nothing living setting off the security system. But I have a couple of anonymous quotes from police officers. One is, "I hate going into this building at night. It gives me the willies." And
Hmm.
the other one says, "Talk to any of the night staff. They'll tell you it's haunted." And as I do these tours, and inevitably I have someone who's worked in one of these buildings. And
Right.
so, like the old Capitol, I had someone who used to work in the building, and they said it's very spooky, especially the basement where there are forms and materials from the early 1900s. And it's just very spooky that you certainly get the sense that it's haunted, that there's strange noises and disembodied footsteps and all those kinds of things. Sylvester Park in downtown Olympia, which is right across the street from the old Capitol building. I didn't know until I started researching that is said to be where the Oregon Trail ended.
Really?
In Sylvester Park, the northernmost spur of the Oregon Trail ended in Sylvester Park. And in fact, there's a boulder at one corner of the park with a plaque on it that was put there in 1913 by the Daughters of the American Revolution, Sacagawea chapter. And the plaque says, here ended the northernmost spur of the Oregon Trail, 1844. And so if you do enough reading about the Oregon Trail, the fact that there were over 300,000 immigrants who took it, 30,000 plus died along the way of various reasons, and just countless ghost stories along the Oregon Trail. And Sylvester Park being part of the Oregon Trail, it said that it also is haunted. And there have been reports of full-bodied apparitions of ghosts in old-fashioned clothing walking across the park. I myself have not seen it, but That's one of the stories. And another reason that's said to be haunted is that there was a war fought in and around Olympia, 1855, 1856, called the Puget Sound War between the U.S. military and the local native tribes. And the primary chief of the native tribes, his name was Chief Leshy. He was hung after all this in 1858 in Steilacoom. And in fact, Pretty Gritty Tours does a tour of Steilacoom, and the ghost of Chief Leshy is one of the ghosts said to be in Steilacoom. Anyway, 1856, the people of Olympia were told that the natives were about to attack. They fled to Sylvester Park, which now it just looks like a town square, a park. Sylvester was from Maine. He wanted it to look like an old-fashioned New England town square. But back in the 1850s, it had barricades and walls and fences, and the U.S. military was there. So the residents of Olympia fled to Sylvester Park, and they were scared to death. They were given ammunition, they were given weapons, they expected the attack to come. It never came. But I think that as I've done research, there are a number of places that have ghost stories attached to them, even though there were no deaths attached to that particular location, including Sylvester Park, which I don't know of any deaths there due to it being part of the Oregon Trail. I don't know of any deaths due to this attack that never came. And then I tell of other places in the Pacific Northwest where there are ghost stories, even though no one died. So that's another place. I also talk about the Forest Memorial Garden Cemetery in Olympia on Pacific Avenue, I believe. It's about a mile to the east of downtown. It's an 1857 cemetery, which means it was during the Victorian era. Queen Victoria was sitting on the British throne from 1937 until 1901. So it was the Victorian era, both in England and in this country. And then I go into a few minutes about what were the strange death practices that the Victorians practiced. And there were many. So, I don't
Give
know.
us some of those.
Okay. So, unlike today, today when people die, they generally die in hospitals or nursing homes or institutions like that. Back in the mid to late 1800s, they mostly died at home. Uh,
Mhm.
and so when people died at home, there were a number of beliefs that these Victorians had, and some of them included when you carried the body of the deceased out of the house, you carried them feet first so that they couldn't beckon the living to follow them.
Oh, mm,
People would turn the photographs, the family photographs, down onto their tables so that supposedly the deceased couldn't make eye contact with the pictures, the images of the family members. The same thought being somehow the deceased could get the living to come with them. They covered mirrors and windows with black crepe and other materials because there was a belief, and there still is a belief in some circles, that mirrors and windows have paranormal properties to them,
they're
and that
portals.
right, they're
From this,
portals,
yeah.
and that souls can get caught in them. That's why Alice in the Looking Glass, that whole story about the mirror and all that. And then also the urban legends like Bloody Mary. I won't say her name more than once, but she got stuck in a mirror. And if you say her name either 3 times or 13 times, depending on which legend you believe, she'll appear and scratch her eyes out. Anyway, they would cover the mirrors and the glass. They would stop the clock in the house when the person died. Otherwise, it would bring bad luck. Um, there's others. One interesting thing that I found that I wasn't aware of when I was writing the first book, Haunted Graveyard of the Pacific, and I was looking at ghost stories from Portland, Oregon. Probably the most famous ghost story is about a prostitute named Emma Merlotin who was murdered, hacked to death, Christmas 1875, I believe it was, 1885, I believe. Um, and they never caught her murderer. And her spirit has been said to haunt the Lone Fir Cemetery in Portland ever since. But one of the Victorian practices, which I didn't know of, was there was a belief that the last image that the murder victim caught in their eyes was that of their murderer. And
Mm,
so they would frequently take out the retinas of the
yeah.
deceased before they buried them and give them to a local photographer to have them develop like film. Of
Wow.
course, that was all debunked. There was no scientific proof of any of that. but it was called retinal optography.
Hmm.
And the scientists seemed to believe it at the time. So that's another thing that the Victorians did, which might sound silly to us nowadays, but they took it very seriously. Necromancy, or trying to communicate with the dead, was very big. They had held seances in theaters and other big public places. They used to take samples of the hair of the dead and keep them, and maybe even turn them into artistic displays, which I've seen in some museums. Just a number of fascinating things that I find fascinating
Yeah,
about
well,
the
I do
Victorians.
too. I think they're very fascinating. So a little speculation now. It's just something I've wondered about after having been involved in the paranormal. So everybody dies, at least as far as I know.
Mhm.
I'm not expecting to continue to live forever. So
Right,
why do some people come back as ghosts, which others can perceive and some don't? What's your thought about that?
right. Well, there are several reasons it's said that ghosts stay behind or come back. One, many of these ghost stories are related to calamities, um, shipwrecks, people dying on board ships, people dying in wars. They've died traumatic deaths, and
Hmm.
so that seems to somehow scar the land and leaves these ghost stories, these ghostly presences, if you believe it. So I think that the manner that someone dies plays into it. And then if you read enough of these things, some people attach themselves. They feel like they have unfinished business. I found, for example, one story, this is along the coast, where a hotel owner injured their arm in life, and all their work fell to their wife and daughter. And supposedly they felt so bad about leaving this all to their family to do, they have come back after they died, and they're thought of as a helpful ghost in this hotel.
Hmm.
They seem to open and close doors when needed, and they're not a scary ghost at all. Uh, so unfinished business. People who don't want to leave loved ones behind is another reason. It's said that ghosts stay on and don't leave. Some ghosts are famous people. Um, for example, I always tell the story of, and that's another type of ghost, as an interactive personality, it's called. And that's the ghost of a loved one who we might see, or a famous person. And I always tell the story of 1942, Prime Minister Winston Churchill of Great Britain was visiting Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the White House. And the story is that Churchill came out of the bathtub, as he frequently was, naked. Tell me if you've already heard this. Smoking a
I
big
haven't.
stogie, smoking a big stogie cigar. And he says, and he swore to the day he died, it's a true story, he came face to face with the ghost of Abraham Lincoln.
Really?
And he said that he said to Abraham Lincoln, Mr. President, you have me at a disadvantage because Churchill was naked.
Yeah.
So, but there have been a number of famous personalities, famous political figures. Um, Aaron Burr, who of course shot Alexander Hamilton, in the famous duel, his ghost has been seen frequently in and around New York City. Benjamin Franklin, supposedly his ghost has been seen in and around Philadelphia.
Hmm.
So there's something about these famous people. They were famous in life, and then they seem to come back as ghosts.
Oh, that's just very interesting. Have you seen in any of your tours or just in hanging out at these various different places, have you seen any apparitions?
Um, Not in the tours of Olympia. And in the books, I always start out by saying, I remain a skeptic. And this is probably because I'm a lawyer also, I require evidence to prove to me that
Right.
something is happening. However, having researched this and writing about this for the last 5 years, there are so many similar stories. There's so much similar evidence between disembodied voices and disembodied footsteps and all over the world. It's not just in the Pacific Northwest or even in this country, that I find it hard to believe that there isn't truth to it. I find that there is truth to it. So in answer to your question, I when I have time, I tell a few quick stories of my own experiences. Um, I was leading tours in underground Astoria, Oregon. A number of Pacific Northwest have undergrounds, and they have ghost tours. Seattle's the
Hmm.
best known. After the 1889 Great Seattle Fire, they raised the city up 2 stories. They have underground tunnels, and there's ghost tours of that. Similar in Portland. Often these are tours over what were the old Chinatown sections and or the Tenderloin, the violent areas. By the way, I didn't know where the word tenderloin came from. And there are tenderloins in Boston and San Francisco, and and the word tenderloin actually was coined in 1879 by a New York City police captain who said that he made so much in bribes in the red light district of New York that he was able to afford tenderloin steak. So that's where the term tenderloin came from. So I thought that was fascinating.
It
Anyway,
is.
I was leading a tour of underground Astoria, Oregon, and I've seen orbs on ghost hunting shows and things like that. And so I was down there, it was dark, and I had my iPhone out and I was videotaping a little bit. I didn't see anything with my eyes, but when I played back the videotape, there
Saw
were
the
orbs.
orbs. Yeah.
And they weren't, my wife would say that's just dust particles and
Hmm.
nose, but they were making right angle turns and they were moving as if they were under some kind of control. And so that's one thing I've seen. Back east, I used to take, as I said, tours of the battlefield of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, 1863, July. That's where the turning point in the Civil War occurred.
Hmm.
I had 2 stories from there. One was I was driving along, and if anyone's been to Gettysburg, you
I
drive up.
have. I
Okay.
have.
And I love Gettysburg for the history and just the feeling of it. That's where Abraham Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. And um, so I was driving along in between, and on one side there were cannons, and the other side there were monuments, and I'm driving, and I saw a reenactor, a Civil War reenactor, in very convincing clothing. Um, Clothing that had holes in it and had soot on it. And it's not uncommon to see Civil War reenactors in Gettysburg. People dress up all the time.
Right.
But this person was so convincingly dressed. I was watching him, and then I would look back as I'm driving, and then I would watch him again and look back. Then when I looked back another time, he was gone. There were no trees for him to go behind. There was no building for him to go behind. He just disappeared. So I thought that's really weird. And then it wasn't too long after that I heard a story about the making of the movie Gettysburg. It was a
Hmm.
1993 movie. It's a very good movie if anyone has a chance to watch it.
I've got it.
And and the producers of that movie, and you may know the story, said that at one point they ran out of blanks for their weapons. It's the only movie ever made on the battlefield of Gettysburg. They ran out of blanks. They put out the word they needed more blanks. And their story was a Civil War reenactor in very convincing clothing with holes in the uniform and soot on the uniform came up and said, "Here you go," and handed them what they thought were blanks. They went to load the blanks and it turned out that they were real. They were
Wow.
real musket balls. And not only that, they later on they dated them back to the Battle of Gettysburg. And so they were never able to find this reenactor again. So
Hmm.
it kind of ties into what I experienced there.
Right.
Another story from Gettysburg. I was on a ghost tour where we were using various equipment, electronic equipment, and I was actually holding dowsing rods,
Hmm.
uh, which I had never used them before, but they're 2 metal prongs that come up and then make a L turn. And so I was holding them. And then all of a sudden, and if you read about these, the criticism of them is that you control them with unconscious movements in your hand, the muscles in your hand. So I'm holding them and they swivel. They both swivel at the same time and come to rest on my shoulders. And I thought, wow, that's really weird. So I said to the tour guide, what is happening with these dowsing rods? And she said, that's your mother hugging you. And I
Really.
hadn't told her that my mother had recently died. So I thought that was weird. And I'll tell you one last story, which is as I was working on the first book, Haunted Graveyard of the Pacific, and I was in my office on the coast. And just prior to that, my in-laws, my wife's parents, had died within 24 hours of each other.
Hmm.
And my wife and her siblings had gone and stayed with them, almost like a hospice situation. And one night, my wife was walking across the room where her mother had died the night before. Um, and it was at nighttime, and she saw something glinting in the moonlight. And she looked down and she picked up a coin, and it was a German Pfennig from 1877. No one knew where this coin could have come from. No one in the house collected old coins. No one wanted it, and knowing that I collect old money and other old things, she brought it home to me. So I was writing the book. I had put the coin behind me on a bookcase. I'm writing, writing, writing. I get up to leave the room. I come back, and the coin is sitting, pardon the expression, dead center in the middle of my office chair, where I
Wow.
had just been sitting. So how could this coin have moved on its own? So I tried to recreate it. I tried to get it to stick to my hand. I couldn't do it. I took it off the chair. I put it back on the bookcase behind me. I'm working for several more hours. I get up and leave. Maybe I shouldn't have been leaving because when I came back again, I found it had moved again, but this time onto my mouse pad by my keyboard.
Wow.
So I picked it up again. I put it back. But before I put it back, I said a little prayer to my mother-in-law and said, I promise to take care of your coin if it was in
Mhm.
fact a coin. And it never moved again. And it's still sitting here right near me. And then if you look at the history, the paranormal meaning behind coins, coins have been thought to be related to the dead ever since ancient Greece. When people would put coins on the eyelids,
Eyes, right.
people who died, so that they could pay the ferryman who would take them across the river Styx to
Hmm.
the afterlife. So who knows? But I thought that was a very strange thing.
Yeah, great stories. Um, this reminds me of a couple things I'll share with you. One about Gettysburg. I went back to Gettysburg when I turned 70. I'm 72 now because I'm just the kind of guy who's interested in that.
Right.
And we did a show with a friend of mine named Lon Strickler, who grew up in Gettysburg. And
Mhm.
he told us a story when he was 9 or 10 years of age. He was riding his bicycle through the battlefield. And all of a sudden, he starts hearing these sounds that he thought were kind of weird. And he described it as being, as he came around this bend, like a movie screen opened up. And what he saw, not only did he hear sounds, he saw Civil War, bat, combatants,
Mhm.
Union and Confederate combatants, and smelled the gunpowder, and
Wow.
just was amazing. And
Wow.
his thought was, so was this some kind of residual haunting, something
Mhm.
that had been impressed on the area that he was in, or did he actually travel in time? And
Mhm.
I thought that was a very interesting experience to have. I didn't have any
Mhm.
experiences in Gettysburg,
Right.
but very interesting place if you're
Right.
into hauntings.
Right. No, I completely agree. And
Yeah,
that's the kind of place you can feel it in the air. Whether you
right,
believe in ghosts or don't believe in ghosts, you can feel the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of soldiers on both sides who were killed in the battle. And many of the bodies were left out on the battlefield for months before they could find a place for burial. And it's just such a traumatic event. It doesn't take much to believe that there could still be a residual
right.
presence or energy left behind. And that's interesting about having travel back in time. So that's a fascinating story.
Yeah, I don't know how you prove one or the others of those. The other thing I want to talk to you a little bit about is the state capitol, the
Hmm.
current state capitol. I have a friend that used to work there. She's retired now, but she got us in there, this Olympia Paranormal Research Group, to do some investigations in there. And one of the amazing things to me is that we were in it was the Secretary of State's office. And I can't remember who the Secretary of State was at the time, um, or previous Secretaries of States, but we did electronic voice phenomena in
Hmm.
there. And I was with somebody who was a medium, and she was talking to people I couldn't see. And when we played that back, my name showed up on the recorder, Dan. And I
Wow.
thought, well, what the hell is that all about? Who would?
Wow.
So I assumed, and I think her name was Belle Reeves, was the Secretary of State who had passed. That impressed me
Hmm.
What do you think electronic voice phenomenon? Have an opinion about that?
Um, I don't own the equipment, and actually I've purposely not bought the equipment because when I lead tours, I do it more from the historical as well as the folklore, the stories that people pass down, that perspective. However, having said that, I have used equipment in the past, and I think that there probably is some validity to the fact that whatever the energy that's left behind, and so many of the ghost stories tie to electrical surges, lights coming on and off, um, security systems going on and off. Um, so obviously there's an energy that impacts those real world things, and it wouldn't surprise me if you could pick them up on these electronic devices. So I think there is some truth to that. I hadn't heard that about the state capitol. So thank you for that. Actually, I will probably work that into my tour. Um, so that's fascinating.
Yeah, and I haven't taken advantage of it, but I was told by, I can't remember who told me this, that they were doing ghost tours at the state capitol. So that might be a further reason to look into what's going
Okay.
on there. I
Okay.
got one more story about electronic voice phenomena. So, and this isn't in Olympia. This is on Ruddle Road in Lacey. There's an
Mhm.
old pioneer cemetery there. And we went there, this Olympia Paranormal Research Group, and people were recording various different things, and they picked up, and I don't remember exactly what it was, but they picked up some kind of recording allegedly coming from one of the graves in the children's section of the cemetery.
Well,
So another strange kind of a thing.
yeah. And there are ghost stories related to Lacey. I heard mentioned earlier that I talk about the 1934 explosion at a dynamite factory that was in easternmost Olympia. Nowadays, it's actually part of Lacey. It's the Hawks Prairie section of Lacey.
Yeah,
And 11 people died, 10 of the workers, male workers, and one female resident nearby. And it's the female resident that, if you look at the Travel Channel, a program called The Dead Files, one
that
of their
felt right.
episodes, which is the only one that I know of that relates to the Olympia area, goes into this person, this woman's story. And it's said that she's become a poltergeist and has been terrifying families in and around where this factory explosion was.
Hmm,
And as I told that story, I had someone on the tour who said that he has seen men, like workers, milling about, ghostly men milling about as if they didn't know where to go or they were lost. And that was in and around the same place where this dynamite explosion took place.
hmm.
So every little town, it's not just
Got their
Olympia.
stories, right?
Every town has an incredibly rich history and all these stories. And yeah, no, it's makes for fascinating research.
Do you know who Barry Taff is?
No.
Okay, so he investigated. There's a movie they made several years ago about a lady who claimed to be being attacked, sexually assaulted by an entity. That's the name of the movie. Barbara Hershey starred as the actress, and the story is about that. But interesting thing that Barry Taff has, and he's been a guest on our show, talked about is he doesn't think poltergeists are separate entities. He thinks poltergeists are projections of our own minds
Hmm.
that cause psychokinetic kinds of things to happen. I don't know how you prove that, but I think that's kind of an interesting thing. And that comes out in his story about the entity. So I don't know. Do you have a perspective about that?
That's an interesting theory. Most of the poltergeist stories that I've come across, especially in the Pacific Northwest, relate to the Shanghai tunnels, the tunnels snaking under
Portland.
Portland and Seattle and Astoria. And that's where the men who were being kidnapped, crimped, it was called back in the late 19th century, and Shanghai to serve on board ships, they were taken through there. And interestingly, it was legal to kidnap men to serve as sailors until 1915, when
Really?
Congress finally passed a law forbidding it. But a lot of the poltergeist stories, the pushing, the pulling hair, things like that, a lot of those stories take place in these tunnels. So to me, that made sense because of the men who were led
Right.
involuntarily through the tunnels. But that's an interesting perspective as far
Yeah.
as
No, as I recall, and I might be wrong about this, you might be more aware of this than I am, but there are some tunnels in Olympia. I heard that there were tunnels that go from like the Spar Cafe downtown toward, you're talking about the state superintendent of public instruction. Have you
Right.
heard anything about that? The tunnels?
Yes,
So what
yes,
do
and
you know about that?
I talk about them on the tour. And so there are stories, like you just said, about underground tours going through Olympia. Um, One is from the Spar Cafe. The Spar Cafe dates back to 1935. It's said to look exactly the same way it looked back in 1935. It's actually was bought out by McMinimans,
Right?
which if you read enough of these stories, you know that that's thought of as being the haunted hotel and restaurant chain. They own 46 businesses in Oregon and 10 in Washington State. Anyway, the Spark Cafe does have an underground. They have an artesian well under there, and I have urban legends about artesian wells I tell also. And then the legend is that there's a tunnel, a Prohibition era tunnel, dating back to 1920 to 1933 when alcohol was illegal in the United States, that would carry alcohol to the old state capitol so that legislators could have their drinks. So I haven't found anything to prove it. I did talk with one of the employees at the Spark Cafe who confirmed that yes, in the underground is the artesian well. There is a tunnel. She said that she hates going down there and the employees won't go down there by themselves, that it's spooky, and that if there's any place in that building that's haunted, that it's there. But that's one of the urban legends. That's not the only underground tunnel. There's also from the old Olympian Hotel, which is now a senior residence living center, directly across the street from Sylvester Park and the old state capitol. There are legends of a tunnel leading from that building over to the old state capitol across the street so that they could transport alcohol during Prohibition. There's also a legend that there's an underground city, like in Seattle,
Really?
underneath the old Hotel Olympian. And supposedly there's a door that's chained off and you can't get through it. And if you could get through it, you would see storefronts and things like that. Again, I have no evidence to show that. I do know that there are other tunnels in Olympia. There's a railroad that runs under Olympia. Actually, at the northernmost border of Sylvester Park, there still is a train that goes through. And in fact, in 2010, it was a big controversy because the train hit and killed a homeless man in
Uh-huh.
Olympia.
Okay,
So
I'm aware of that.
there are still underground train tracks, but these Prohibition era tunnels, there are rumors, there's legends. I've looked at old maps and old diagrams of buildings in the underground of Olympia, and it's not clear to me that there were these Prohibition era tunnels, but there certainly are tunnels under Olympia.
Uh-huh. Okay, I've got one final thing for you, and then I'll let you go here.
Okay.
Um, I tend to be kind of a cryptid guy. I'm not sure why. We do a lot of shows on cryptids because I'm interested in cryptid.
Yeah.
So, two things. You mentioned Joint Base Lewis McChord. So
Right.
I follow something called the BFRO, Bigfoot Field Research Organization, and
Mhm.
there's some stories about encounters with Bigfoot during nighttime military types of things
Huh.
on JBLM. And the other thing that I'm on Facebook, and the other thing on Facebook, I saw somebody post something about Priest Point Park, where they had some evidence. They found some footprints that they thought were Bigfoot footprints. What do you know about Bigfoot in this area, if
So
anything?
I'm gonna write these down so I
Yeah,
can, so JBLM,
yeah, Joy Base Lewis McCord.
and then the other one was Reese Park.
No, no, it's Priest Point Park. They
Reese.
uh, they renamed it to I think it's called Squaxin Park in honor of the indigenous folks. And there's one other interesting thing that has nothing to do with Bigfoot. There's in some place, and I haven't been there, but someplace within Squaxin Park, there's a phone, an old-fashioned phone that's attached to a tree. And the idea is that people can use this phone to call their dearly departed. Now,
Huh.
I've heard about that, haven't seen it, but and if you want to address any of those things, particularly the Bigfoot stuff, that would be of interest to me.
Okay. So I've looked very hard specifically for stories in the Olympia area related to Bigfoot. Um, there are things out there online that talk about how Olympia has had Bigfoot sightings. I've not been able to find anything specific. Um, there are other parts of the Pacific Northwest that have far more stories. Grays Harbor County
Yeah,
along the coast considers them to be the capital of Bigfoot country, and they have an annual conference. Supposedly there have been sightings there. There have been sightings in forests and mountainous locations throughout Washington and Oregon. I have not heard of anything specific. Yours is the most specific story I've heard related to Olympia. I could go on for a while about the history of Bigfoot
hmm,
and all the sightings, and it makes for a fascinating history. And of course, Washington has the greatest number of Bigfoot sightings in the country, but there are Bigfoot sightings in every state in the
right.
country.
I would tell you about, if you don't know about the Bigfoot Field Research Organization, BFRO, they have a map of the United States with all the Sasquatch sightings that people report. And they have it by state. So in Washington, you can look up Thurston County and see how many reported sightings there have been of Bigfoot. Doesn't mean Bigfoot's been actually here, but there've been those reported sightings. So it'd be
Okay.
interesting to look at that. So
Yeah, I did know about PFRO, but I have not looked at their map, so I
yeah.
will do that.
Yeah, interesting. Well, Ira, I want to thank you for taking time to hang out with us. This has been very enjoyable for me. I hope it wasn't unenjoyable for you.
I
I'd
enjoyed
like
it.
I'd like to invite you to come to Stranger Things. You'd be a big hit at Stranger Things some Monday. And just thanks for doing this. And we'll let you know once the recording is up, and we'll send you a link.
Okay, sounds great.
So
I
thank you,
appreciate
and
it.
thanks, Chris, too.
Absolutely. I appreciate it. I've enjoyed talking with you, and
Yeah.
have a great rest of the day.
Okay, we'll see you. Bye
Okay,
bye.
bye.